أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First and foremost, thank you to Isa for inviting me for having this webinar. I hope that this is going to be a useful exchange. So the way that I've crafted this particular presentation is I'll give you an overview on what the academy is, what the tradition is, how have these two worked over time leading to the contemporary space of what we call Islamic studies. And then I'll get a bit more personal in what are the challenges that I encountered, and then also how I engage with them. I have by design tried to limit this to a 50-minute talk, maybe up to 60 minutes, we'll see. But I will open the floor for Q&A so that hopefully we can have a nice exchange, inshallah. Is everyone happy with that plan? Just a yes or no in the chat. And please do forgive me, by the way, just in case I go teacher mode. I'm just used to making sure that I have feedback from everyone because I can't see everyone, but you guys can see me. So just a quick feedback in the chat. Everyone, yep, everyone happy with that plan? Just a yes or no? Yep, excellent, excellent, very, very cool. So we've got a few responses coming in. Alhamdulillah. All right. So here's the overview. I'm just going to start by setting the stage, and then I'll walk you through the history of what we mean by Islamic studies, right? How did this develop within the academy? What is this space called Islamic studies? I'll then go into, once I've established a history, I then want to go into the different modes of Islamic studies as well as the different fields, and these are two slightly different things. I'll then end on a personal note, and then inshallah we can take it from there, right? So just to start off, I'm aware that in this particular gathering, we probably have three kinds of backgrounds who've logged in. So these are either university students who want to engage with Thoth, perhaps haven't done it in a way that they're comfortable with, and then vice versa, so graduates of from the Madaris, right? And then there are some students, I'm sure, who are probably, they have feet in both, and I am keeping all three audiences in mind for the sake of this particular presentation. So just have that reflexivity that you are going to find, even within this setting, I'm sure, people who come from slightly different backgrounds than yourself. Now, why did we start with this conversation? Like, what is the whole point of having a discussion about what the academy is all about? Well, I think that there comes a point for many upcoming students that they feel that there is some kind of rift between the seminary or the tradition and university and the academy, right? Some people even believe that the academy is hostile to religious faith, right? Others believe that the Turath cannot gain any oxygen in the academy. And it is to these concerns that I'll be speaking to, both in light of how the field of Islamic studies has evolved, as well as how I've engaged with the university setting. Um, so I think a few clarifications are important. Like, what do I mean by the academy? You will find different definitions for this. But what I simply mean is these are dedicated institutions where you have undergraduate teaching, postgraduate teaching, PhDs, right? You can develop yourself as a scholar here. You can provide courses, produce articles. Those are the kind of hubs that I'm talking about, right? And what do I mean by the traditions? Even here, there's debate on what do we mean by Turath, which Turath, whose Turath, right? So I am speaking for the most part as a confessional Sunni Muslim, right? And what I mean by the Turath from that context is specifically that there are recognized orthodoxies, there are recognized disciplines, there are recognized scholars and books that we study within the seminary system, right? So if you are a Sunni Muslim, for instance, you're probably going to be in the Ash'ari or the Maturidi or the Athari camp, for example. You'll be studying, for the most part, either a Maliki text, you'll be studying a Hanafi text, Hanbali text, or a Shafi'i text if you're going into fiqh, right? And then if you are into tasawwuf, you will be in a variety of different turuq, right? Naqshbandi, Chishti, whatever have you. So it's those orthodoxies that I'm referring to as the tradition in a very broad sense. Is everyone with me so far? Everyone happy with that? So those are just some broad, encompassing phrases by what I mean by the academy and what I mean by the tradition, as in like the seminaries, right? And I think against that, I want to situate myself because I'm aware that I do not share your experiences, right? So all of us have different backgrounds, and I'm sure that our experiences shape who we are, how we think. And I think it's very important, particularly in a setting like this, for me to be very transparent on how my experiences have shaped me. So I was born and raised in Kuwait. I have a Pakistani background. Both of my parents are Pakistani. My grandfather from my dad's side moved to Kuwait. My dad was born and raised in Kuwait, and I was born and raised in Kuwait. We've been in a British school for me and my brother, both of us were born and raised in a British school for the most part. As for the accent, I don't know where that comes from, but I don't have a British accent. I then moved to the UK when I was 18. I did my undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, and then straight after that, I did a PhD in chemical engineering. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the British system, if you do really well in your undergrad, you don't need to do a master's to do a PhD. So that's why I didn't get a master's in chemical engineering, right? So for the most part, I have been brought up in a STEM culture, right? And up to this point, I did not have any grounding in the Turath whatsoever, right? It was actually during my first PhD that something completely shifted in me, very radically. When I started my undergrad, this was the year 2007. And I don't know if some of you remember, but this was when we had the 7/7 bombings in London. Do you guys remember that? In 2007, there was something big. This was shortly after the 9/11 event, but there was also the 2007 bombings, train bombings in the UK. And because of that, when my parents sent me over to the UK, they were very, very wary, and scared, in sending their son to the UK. And they advised me constructively, stay away from any Islamic society. So for my whole undergrad, for the most part, I never joined any Islamic society. It was only towards the end, when I was about to graduate, did I start encountering brothers and all of that. But my upbringing was, for the most part, very secular, right? We went to the Friday prayers. We didn't know much about it. We know the quls, we recited Surah Ikhlas, that was it. But that was our Islam. That was my brothers and my Islam, right? Now in the PhD, in my first PhD, that's when things started shifting. So I think I gained some maturity and I decided to actively get involved in the ISOC. And so for those of you who don't know, the ISOC are these after-school extracurricular activities that we do. One of the groups is called ISOC, Islamic Society. The American equivalent is called the MSA, Muslim Student Association. And I joined that, and actively, it completely changed the game for me. That, in parallel to my supervisor, who was an atheist, and he was a very lovely professor. He was a very, very good supervisor, really nice. He would always keep his students as a priority, his PC students. And he started asking me questions that I never gave thought to, like why am I Muslim? Because he probably understood from my name that I was a Muslim, right? And I didn't know. I don't know why I was a Muslim. And that kind of set me on a particular journey. And I don't know if you guys know Al-Kawthar, Al-Maghrib, these institutions that were very big in the day, 20 years ago. And back then, they had these weekend programs all across the UK, in Birmingham and Manchester. And I remember attending my first one. It was a big thing because you feel very intimidated, right? You feel like you're going into a gathering which would you feel like everybody is a qari, everybody's a hafid al-Quran, everybody is a muhaddith, everybody is a mufassir, right? Everyone is like you feel like you're nothing. You're like nothing in this space. So, but alhamdulillah, I started going to those, and that started opening my world to Islamic studies. I started learning what tafsir is. I started understanding what hadith is. I started understanding what aqidah is. And I just knew by the second year of my first PhD, I just knew I wasn't going to be an engineer. I always knew I was going to be an academic, that was my goal, but I just didn't know that I was not going to be an engineer anymore. And I remember having a difficult conversation with my own father. I told him, that I think that I want to go to Azhar, I want to go to Medina and just study Islam. And he said I mean, as a father who's been in the rat race, who's worked his whole life to get his sons, established, he was a bit taken back. Naturally, you have that experience. But he said, finish the degree, finish the PhD, and it'll put food on the table. And it was solid advice. It was very, very good advice. So I finished the first engineering degree, and I did that in 2014. And at the same time, then I moved over to Dubai, and I got a job as an assistant professor in Dubai. I taught chemistry, right, for the most part, and that was a great backing. That was really, really good. And I remember I met some shuyukh within UAE, and they told me just to do my ta'aleem online for various reasons. We don't need to get that in here. So I started studying with mashayikh privately. I think my biggest edification was when I studied with Sheikh Ali Laraki. He's a Maghribi scholar. He's a Moroccan scholar. And he really opened up my world to Kalam, like Ash'ari Kalam proper. And I remember for 2 years we were solid, having classes, and I just remember I kept throwing questions. And he was a very funny sheikh. Like he was one of those mashayikh who you knew he was a good teacher. You just knew, right? And I remember that was the biggest transformation that I had from that side. And I just fell in love with Kalam. Kalam was just like the thing for me. And just from, being in Dubai, there was also access points to various institutions. So for example, back in 20, Sheikh Ali Laraki, yeah, Sheikh Ali Laraki, he's a Maghribi scholar. He's from Leicester, but I think he vacillates between Morocco and Leicester, from Tangier. So he's a very funny scholar, very, very, very good scholar, very humble, very nice. You can kind of throw anything at him. And he's one of those like, shuyukh who engages both worlds. Like he knows the modern stuff as well. He knows the classical stuff as well. He's a Maliki scholar, right? So, anyways, just because of being in Dubai, I also got in touch with a company called, or an organization called Kalam Research and Media. So, for those of you who don't know, if you research Kalam Research and Media, KRM, they were a big Kalam think tank in the UAE a decade ago. They fizzled out now, but that was a big thing, and I got to meet some various individuals, brilliant minds like Sheikh Hamza Karamali. He was like a big active researcher during that. And then finally, what I realized was I wanted to kind of get into this space, but I also didn't want to leave my scientific training behind me, right? And that's when I got into this field called science and religion. And it just so happened, the University of Edinburgh, where I'm a lecturer now, they opened up an online version of the program, right? So there's an MSc in philosophy, science, and religion. And I did that in 2017. And this is the time when I just got married. I had my first child. I actually have one child for now. I don't know why I said first. My one child, Jonah. And then I did the program, and I was doing this while I was working, right? It was very hard. It was very, very hard. And studying is very hard generally when you're working. But I did that, and Alhamdulillah, I absolutely loved it. But I realized there's very little Islamic, narratives here. Very little. So I wanted to see if I could like really kind of make my way in here. And ironically, the person who mentored me the most was a non-Muslim scholar. His name is Professor Mark Harris. He's the one who guided me, who trained me up, etc. And eventually, that monograph that Brother Isa mentioned in the beginning, Islam and Evolution, it was under his book series, and I'll get to that in a second. So that program really kind of allowed me to transition from science to science and religion. And it is at that point that I realized, khalas, I'm not going to be an engineer. I'm just going to now start focusing on working in this space. And since then, Alhamdulillah, I was able to publish a lot on evolution. I'm now kind of going into broader spaces. And by the tawfiq of Allah, I got my position here as lecturer. Just to be clear, because I want people to realize that none of this came by like ease, or none of it was, spoon-fed or gifted to me. I actually lost my job in 2022, right? The position in Dubai got canceled for various reasons, and so I was out of work. And I was planning to actually go to the States, and because I was going to be a science director for an Islamic school called Amal School. That was my track. But then this opportunity opened up. I applied, assuming that I would not get it. I was shortlisted, and alhamdulillah, we're here now 2 years later, so 3 years later now. So I just wanted to clarify that none of this was, taken for granted. This is all very luckily coming into in fashion. So I just wanted to make it very, very clear that this is a very, very lucky opportunity. I know that the place that I'm in, I could not have been in this place very, very easily. But what I do in my work in the space of science and religion is I take the Islamic tradition very seriously, and I use it to construct new interfaces with Islam and science. So I know I spent some time there on my positionality, but I hope that that was accessible, at least to get everyone on the same page to understand where I am, where I'm coming from, right? And that may or may not resonate with your experience, but it's good to be wary of that. So moving on now to kind of get a clear overview here, I think that history is very important, right? History is a great teacher. And to understand where Islamic studies is today, we need to understand how it started, right? So this space that we call Islamic studies, you will find many courses, Islamic studies, right? That's the generic program. This was initially started with a colonial mindset, right? The initial encounter started off with this Eurocentric vision that the Islamic civilization, they had some interesting ideas, etc. But Islam was never studied on its own terms or on its own metrics. It was understood as an inferior civilization that had nothing to offer, at least during the early 1900s, right? So Islam was understood as an object of study, not a living tradition. And it is here where Orientalism was born. So the initial scholars that started understanding Islam, at least as an object of study, it was thought to be understood as a passivization, and there were no longer active voices, right? So I'm assuming that some of you have heard of this idea that philosophy and science are dead in the Islamic world. There's no more philosophy in the Islamic world. Muslims never were, real scientists, or the decline narrative. Have you guys heard of those ideas before? It's very well known in the in some of these like older works. So this is where it was created. Those notions were created here. And that's why you see sometimes a lot of negativity from certain Muslim scholars because they depicted Islam in a very negative light, right? And this is also where you get this very famous decline narrative that Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, which I assume some of you may know, he's the one who kind of shunned philosophy. He's the one who shunned science, right? The work that they refer to is the incoherence of the philosophers. So modern day atheists, for example, they still portray this narrative. They say that Ghazali wrote a book called Incoherence of the Philosophers, and therefore that's why the Muslim world is here where it is today, which is completely false. That whole narrative is false. Ghazali never actually did that, right? But why was this developed? Why did it work? Because I think it fit with the European mindset that Europe was progressing. It's the most advanced civilization. Islam is a backwards, inferior religion. The Muslim world is inferior. It's incapable of kind of having philosophy or even having, scientific progress. And therefore, it was where it was today, right? Does everyone with me so far? Does that make sense, everyone? Yeah, everyone happy with that? That was the narrative. That was the narrative that was propped up in the early years. For the most part, this is going to be largely, simplish, but it's by design, and hopefully we can get into details shortly. Now, at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that while these developments were taking place in the academy, the Muslim world was also going through a lot of political changes. So this is a map that is quite edifying, right? So if you look at the orange areas, those were the boundaries of the caliphate. Those are the boundaries, right? Over time, there was dissolution, right? And eventually, we lost the caliphate in 1924. So a lot of the Muslim world that me and you and I see today, these are novel countries. These are novel borders. These are borders that were given to us, right? And when I say us, I'm speaking here as a confessional Muslim. And that means that when these countries were born or developed, you have to do constitution building. Now, a question for all of you, is it easy to start a country from scratch or is it difficult? What do you guys think? Is it easy or difficult? It's very difficult. You have to come up with a constitution. You have to come up with infrastructure. You have to develop an economy. You have to find resources. You have to find things that can get you to a standard of living which can sustain societies. Super, super, super difficult, right? And so when all of this was happening, we were forced into disarray. And I think it's in part because of this post-colonial situation that we are in. We are in a post-colonial world that I think Muslims had to be they had to be thrown into an extreme form of rapid form of modernization. And it is here where you begin to see this massive differentiation between universities in the West and universities and education systems in the Muslim world, right? And this is also where you get that bubbling of Islam versus the West, right? It is also here where you get Islamization of knowledge. It's through this kind of background system. And Why am I highlighting this in particular is because of this fundamental reason. Sheikh Hamza Karamali, who is a very good scholar of Kalam, he now resides in Turkey. He's Canadian himself. He's a bit like me, but the opposite. So he, mashallah, went through a seminary system very intensively for 20 years, and now he's trying to provide an accessible program into Kalam for many students worldwide. He has a paper that he wrote a couple of years ago from Kalam Research and Media, interestingly. In that paper, he says that there has been a very serious rift between the madaris and contemporary, developments, particularly in science. And there was a further rifting because of this system shock with these education infrastructures. Think of it from the lens of a parent, right? If you are a parent, back in the day, you would send your kids to the madrasa. Those were the knowledge hubs, those were the centers of knowledge, right? But now, when the colonizers came in, they deposited and set up their own institutions. Now, when you're thinking of the betterment of your children, if you wanted secure jobs, where will you send your children most likely? The madrasa or the university? Which one? What do you guys think? Where are you going to send it? If you want to guarantee that your child will have jobs, your child will have, that's the school, that's university. So this rift was created, right? And this rift is felt today. It is for this reason why you sometimes have, this is the reason why you have sometimes a huge divide between those that graduate from the madrasas and those that graduate from the universities, right? And there are all kinds of accounts that you'll find to this effect. But simply what I'm trying to highlight here is that this rift, at least in part, is by design. It is there by design, right? If you can decouple the tradition from ongoing knowledge, you make it to a large degree immobile and ossified, right? And I think this is the challenge, at least in part, for those Muslims who are trying to enter the academy, is how do you bridge that divide, right? How do you bridge that divide? Okay. So now given that context, this is why you will find that the academic production of things is very uneven. Sorry, one second. Jonah, say this. Don't come in the video. Yes, what do you want, Jonah? What do you want? No, no, yeah, no, 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 not that. Sorry, my son is here. I'm solo parenting, so my wife is out of country. So have it later, not now. Okay, Jonah? Sorry about that. So, as I was saying, that the academic production for this reason is very, very uneven, right? If you think of in terms of exploration of ideas in science, if you think in terms of exploration ideas of philosophy, usually it's Eurocentric narratives that are dominant here, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're correct. That's a different story. But at least it goes to show that there was, because of this economic imbalance, there was further benefits that the Europeans had or the West had over the Muslim world because the European Western environments did not have to do rebuilding of societies. This was a largely Muslim experience. Everyone me so far? Yeah. So this is a narrative. I'm just stringing a narrative, right? And there's a point to this narrative. Where the game changed somewhat in Islamic studies is the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism. Have you guys heard of this text? Just a yes or no in the chat. It's a very, very important text for those, particularly who are wanting to get into the academy. And Edward Said, what he does very well is that he shows within the Islamic space that we need to be a bit more reflexive, right? That the way we are seeing the Orient, the way we're seeing the Muslim world is through certain assumptions that are not necessarily true, right? And he's the one who kind of exposed that the way Islamic studies is portrayed, researched, and taught is largely through a very colonial lens, where power dynamics began to affect what is on the ground in the Muslim world, as opposed to the opposite. What does Islam say for itself? So what he got right was definitely he brought a form of self-awareness in the academy that perhaps maybe the presumptions that I have, maybe they're not true. Now, what he ended up, I think, getting wrong was he, in trying to show that Orientalism is problematic, he actually created a monolith out of who he was criticizing. Not all Orientalists were bad. Not all Orientalists were problematic. Some Orientalists were more problematic than others, right? But at least his book created a massive impact in the field. And it is here that we begin to see Islamic studies becoming a lot more self-aware. the methods of studying Islam, the content of studying Islam become much more diverse. They become pluralized, right? And during this narrative, this is where you begin to see more and more Muslim scholars who are trying to come into the academy and to try and avoid simplistic narratives and to try and maybe revise some of the long-standing assumptions, right? So we're going to get into what and how those models are. But the reason why I wanted to go through this history was as follows. This explains why things like Islamic theology is often marginalized. It's often why Muslims feel very uncomfortable in the academy, right? It's because there are powers imbalance, there are imbalances of power, there are imbalances of the way things are taught, right? And sometimes I even when I speak to young students, particularly those who come from the seminary, they feel like they get a system shock when they go into Islamic studies. Like as soon as you got Islamic studies, I remember one student, she said to me, Shoaib, the first week and I'm studying like LGBTQT and Islam, I'm like, what's this? So so there's a real radical rift between the two. There's a very real radical rift, right? So having kind of gone through that history, where are we today? To understand the state of affairs today, it's important to distinguish between modes of doing research in the academy and fields of research, right? So modes of research are how people are looking at Islam. And I think it's helpful to go over the different kinds. Before I continue, can everyone see a table? Because sometimes the tables don't show. Can you guys see a table here? Can everyone see a table? Yeah, there's excellent, very good. So this table is a summary of the different ways people go on about doing Islamic studies. So one mode of research is descriptive. You are describing a state of affairs. So this means largely intellectual history. So you go into the history and you try to come up with narratives to see what people are doing. How did Ghazali react to Avicenna? How did Falan scholar react to his interlocutor? How did the Safavids, for example, gain inheritance, etc., all of that, right? This also moves into anthropological work, right? So you're describing how do Muslim Berbers, work in the Maghribi region? How do Muslim scholars think of things like marital laws in India and Pakistan, for example? So this is descriptive. You are not making claims on how people ought to behave. You are describing the state of affairs. Normative is the opposite. You want to say what is true or what is binding for Muslims, right? And this is where mostly ilm al-kalam, theology, and law come in. So you are doing meaningful, constructive stuff here. Does everyone see the difference? So describing, you're just stating what things are. Normative, how things ought to be, right? These are very two different modes of thinking, right? What is correct belief versus incorrect belief? How should Muslims behave? What is halal? What is haram, etc. Right? There is also a third mode where you're trying to explore, right? So given we have these certain tools and ideas within the Turath, how can we explore them for meaningful discussions, right? And here you will find a variety of ideas. So for example, how does the Turath, for instance, engage with the idea of AI? How does the Turath, for example, engage with the idea of evolution, for example? So it's an exploration phase. There's also comparative. So have you heard of this very visible line called Islam, Muslim, Christian relations? Have you heard, or Muslim Christian relations? Have you heard of that field before? This is a field that kicked off, I think, in the last 30, 40 years. So Muslim Christian relations you can even do a whole PhD on it. You can even do a whole MSc on it. It's a very visible line. And here we do a lot of comparative stuff. So you're comparing Islam or an idea or an interlocutor with something from another tradition, something from another, perspective, right? And this is a way of kind of, juxtaposing things that have never been juxtaposed before, right? And of course, you also have revisionists. So this idea that the Muslim world did not produce philosophy, did not produce science, some scholars have pushed back against this to revise the status quo of the academy. So there's an individual called George Saliba. He wrote a very good book with MIT Press, right? And in there, he goes to show that, first of all, Ghazali never caused a decline. Second, after Ghazali, there were many scholars whose manuscripts have been dug up in which they do things like astronomy, in which they do things like philosophy, right? Way after Ghazali's death, showing that the decline thesis was a constructed thesis, right? It is not true. And that's now, and because of those revisionist works, the academy is now a lot more mature about what actually does Islam have to say about these things. Does everyone see the differences between these modes? Is everyone happy about that? Yeah, just say yay or nay in the chat. Is that clear? Descriptive, normative, explorative, comparative, and revisionist. Yeah. Now, these are conceptually divided very neatly here. Of course, in any research line, some of these are mixed, right? So sometimes you'll have normative and explorative, right? Sometimes you have revisionist and comparative, no problem there. There's always usually, however, one more dominant than the other. That's the important point. There's always going to be one more dominant than the other. So in my own field, for example, I have PhD students. Some of them are doing very descriptive stuff. So I have, for example, one student, he's looking at Islam and evolution in Indonesia, right? He's just describing what do ulama there believe about evolution. So it's the first study of its kind. So that will be descriptive, right? I have another student who is looking at Islam and evolution. He's comparing the Ash'ari responses to evolution with the Catholic Church, right? So this is going to be largely comparative. Are those examples clear to everyone? Everyone happy with that? So you will see that sometimes these are very divisible. Sometimes these are a little bit more in the mix. It just depends. One is usually the more dominant one in every research line. So those are the different ways Muslims are engaging or academics are engaging with Islam. Now comes to the field of Islamic studies. What do we mean by Islamic studies today, right? And I think that this is where I am going to try and maybe show you that there are many ways to do Islamic studies in the modern academy, right? For the most part, if you were to search Islamic studies, you will find probably these 5 lines for the most part, right? The first one is intellectual history. The second one is contemporary and global Islam. Third one is Islamic theology. Fourth one is Islamic philosophy and Islam and science. And I'm going to go through each one of these one by one. But have you guys seen these before? Just basic searches. Some of you might already be involved with these, but are these visible lines in your own experiences and your own searches of what Islamic studies is all about? Are these visible to you? Yeah? Okay. Alhamdulillah. Very good. Excellent. So some of you do find these. Okay. Excellent. Very good. Now, what is intellectual history? For the most part, this is what a large portion of Islamic studies is all about, right? So through the developments of Islamic studies through the lens of, at least in its initial reception, Orientalism, Islamic studies has largely become a historical study. That's why you will find a lot of emphasis on linguistics, philology, manuscript analysis, going through those archives, finding the libraries, etc. So if you have read, for example, Frank Griffel, if you've read, for example, I don't know, books on Suhrawardi or Ibn Arabi, all of this was done based off of people going through archives, finding manuscripts, and developing narratives, right? And many things are studied within this intellectual history. You will find studies in kalam, you will find study in law, in falsafa, in exegesis, in tafsir, in Quran, wal hadith, etc. Right? And you will also find people studying in different parts of the world, also different time periods, right? So, what was, for example, the debates about marital relationships in India before the partition, for example? What were the thoughts of how did the ideas of Avicenna, for example, make their way into Malaysia and Indonesia when the Dutch were colonizing the two countries, right? For example, right? So this is intellectual history. You are going into a historical mode. Some of the main people that you will find in this space, and just to be clear, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the main players that you'll find. Khalid al-Ruayhib, for example, he's very well known for his works on post-classical kalam. So after Avicenna, what were some of the debates surrounding kalam? He's also done work in logic. Ayman Shahade, for example, very big scholar on Fakhruddin al-Razi, right? While Halaq, I think most of you know who he is, very, very big scholar on Orientalism, colonization, Islamic law. He's quite well versed in a variety of fields. Frank Griffel, he's written two important monographs. One is on Ghazali, for example. His more recent one, post-classical Islam, right? Jonathan Brown, famous for hadith studies, right? What does the Turath actually say about hadith scholarship and all of that, right? Shadad Rizvi, very famous Shia theologian at the University of Exeter, right? So these are some of the main figures. These are not the only figures. I'm just giving you a handful from different pots, okay? Everyone happy with Islam intellectual history? So that's what we mean for the most part. This is what people mean by Islamic studies. That largely it's a historical analysis of things, right? That's what we mean by it for the most part. Oops. Right. Then we have contemporary and global Islam. You will find this also in the form of undergraduate studies or postgraduate studies. Here, you are trying to understand contemporary realities, right? So you look at contemporary political exchanges, you look at contemporary social problems or anthropology, right? And some of the people that you will find here, for example, are Talal Asad. I'm assuming most of you have heard of this name. Talal Asad, very, very big commentator on the contemporary malaise of the Muslim world. Ibrahim Musa, Notre Dame University, he does work on the madrasa. What does the madrasa mean today, right? What do we mean by a seminary today? What is the function of a madrasa? He himself is a graduate, right, of a madrasa. And now he's an academic. He's one of those rare people who have footings in both, right? Oliver Roy, French scholar, does a lot of work on political Islam. Taha Abdurrahman, the Moroccan scholar, a lot of work has been done on his ethical philosophy. Mona Siddiqui does a lot of Christian Muslim stuff in the contemporary space, right? Everyone happy so far? Yeah, this is what I mean by contemporary global Islam. We're doing ethnographic, political stuff, ethnographic stuff, social studies. That's what we mean here in this space. Now, when we think about theology, right? Theology here needs to be understood in a very careful way. There are two meanings of theology. There's a broad sense, and then there's a very narrow sense. Now, in the Turath itself, when we say theology, this largely refers to ilm al-kalam. It's to do with beliefs, i'tiqadat, right? That's what it means. It's to do with beliefs, right? Ilm al-kalam is what is usually rendered as theology. But theology in the academy is referred to anything referring to God in terms of his laws, in terms of his, his speech, in terms of revelation. And so therefore it includes a variety of things. It doesn't just mean ilm al-kalam. It also means ethics, which means things like usul al-fiqh. It means fiqh as well, right? Political theology, etc. Does everyone see the difference between the broad sense and the narrow sense? In the academy, theology is a broad encompassing word, right? It's a very, very broad encompassing word. And in that space, you will find a variety of attitudes. And slowly now, I think slowly now, we are seeing different ways that people are doing theology. For the most part, it has always been descriptive, right? But now, with people like Ramon Harvey, who's at Cambridge Muslim College, he's taking, for example, Maturidi thought and applying it today. Sherman Jackson, he wrote a very beautiful book called The Problem of Black Suffering. In that book, he takes the four schools within the Turath, Maturidi, Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, Athari, right? And therefore, he is using those to talk about the problem evil for black Muslims. So he's taken classical schools, put them in a new context, right? He's put them in a new context. Is everyone seeing, you can have these different spaces. Khalid Abu Fadl, he is a contemporary faqih. He was born and raised in Kuwait. He's now, I think, in George Washington, or he has his own institute now, Usul University, if I'm not mistaken. And he does a lot of work on law. How can we talk about law meaningfully in today's time? Muhammad Ghali, very interesting scholar, Hamad bin Khalifa University. He is, again, one of those rare scholars who has footings in both. He is, I think, a seminarian. He graduated from Al-Azhar, if I'm not mistaken. And he does a lot of work on medicine, right? He does a lot of work on medicine. So things like genetic engineering, things like euthanasia, things like organ transplantation. How does Islam respond to those? Very contemporary applications. Is everyone with me so far? Yeah? Is everyone with me so far? Just say yay or nay in the chat. I have a question here by Dima. I'm just going to respond to this. I'm assuming, Dima, you mean what we mean by the difference between the broad and the narrow sense? That's what you're asking me? Yes, okay. So in the narrow sense, when you study in a seminary, in a madrasa, so if you go the traditional track, when you study theology, this means you're studying a subject area called ilm al-kalam. And ilm al-kalam just means the study of your beliefs and how you defend it, right? So, for example, you believe in the Prophet ﷺ, you believe in the Akhirah, you believe in the certain conditions of the Sahaba, you believe that they're going to be punished in the grave, right? You believe all of those things, right, Dima? That's what you've been taught at a young age, right? So, why are those beliefs there? How do you ground those beliefs? That's kalam. That is ilm al-kalam. That's theology, right? But theology in the English world does not necessarily mean just ilm al-kalam. It has a broader definition. It means anything to do with God or revelation or even how theology is expressed politically, for example, right? So theology in this broad sense includes things like ilm al-kalam, which is where you study beliefs, but also usul al-fiqh and fiqh, which is where you study what is halal and haram. Does that make sense, Dima? Is that clear? So in the internal to the Islamic architecture, there are divisions, but in the English way of defining them, it encompasses more than sometimes. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Excellent. Very, very good. Cool. Excellent. Cool. Then you have Islamic philosophy. So Islamic philosophy means that you are using contemporary tools of logic to be able to slice and dice arguments, right? And one of the biggest journals in this space is the Journal of Religious Studies, right? And here, what you do is you reconstruct arguments, you test for coherences, you test their implications. So it's a very analytic mode, right? You can do Islamic philosophy historically if you want to, but at least some of the main players in this space are the ones that you see on the screen. Fedor Benovich, for example, he's a very good Avicenna scholar. He's here at the University of Edinburgh. Muhammad Saleh Zarpour, he is at the University of Manchester. Nazim Muhtaraglu, he's at the moment at Yale. Peter Adamson, a very, very well-known scholar. He does a lot of good work on excavating the history of Islamic philosophy. John McGinnis as well, right? So these are some of the big players in this space. And then finally, Islam and science. This is the field that I'm in. This is a relatively new space, and here Islam is being juxtaposed with questions that emerge out of physics, out of evolution. Artificial intelligence is one of the main areas now, right? I'm assuming all of you have thought about AI, what it is, what is it not, etc., right? And here you have some figures. Like these figures include Sayyid Hussein Nasr. He's from a particular Shi'i perspective. Nidal Qusum, he is at the American University of Sharjah. He's a physicist. Oscar Koja, he's at Bayan Claremont College in the US. Basil Al-Ta'i, he's one of those scholars who engages with physics. He's actually a very, very, very high-ranking physicist. He actually has a constant named after him, mashallah, right? He's a very, very high-level physicist. He engages with Kalam. He believes that there are certain things in Kalam that link up, for example, with quantum mechanics today. Asim Padella, for instance, he does a lot of work on developments within medicine and how Islam can respond to those. So, for instance, have you guys heard of ectogenesis before? Have any of you heard of ectogenesis? Just a yes or no in the chat. Have you heard of the word ectogenesis? What is ectogenesis? Yes, no? What do you? Yes, you have? Okay, excellent. So some of you are saying yes, some of you are saying no, right? So ectogenesis is artificial wombs, right? So we can take the sex cells from the mother and father, and we can put that in some kind of a chamber, and that chamber then gets fed nutrients from machines. What it means is you can outsource labor, and therefore a woman has to never go through labor and pregnancy, right? This is now real world tech. It's not like Mission Impossible. It's not science fiction. It's here now. Ectogenesis, here's how you spell it, ectogenesis, right? So how does Islam respond to that? People like Asim Padella have done some work in this space. So does everyone see what I'm saying? Yeah. Everyone happy with that? Yeah. Everyone happy with that? Islamic economics, I don't know, Khola. I mean, like perhaps that hasn't gained much oxygen. I don't see that as a clear, visible line as of yet. But that may be my own limitations. That may be my own limitations, right? Okay, so now that everyone has had kind of an appreciation of the different lines of Islamic studies, I can now kind of walk through what are the challenges that I faced when kind of looking into this. As I stated earlier, I try to engage the Turath very constructively. And this is because my teacher, Sheikh Ali Raki, he said something once to me that it just never left me. It was a very beautiful statement. And he said, Shoaib, Islam is not just an artifact in the museum. And when he said that, and subhanAllah, something just clicked in my mind. Like, yeah, why do we study these scholars this historically? We need to be able to engage with these ideas today, here and now. And so that became a spark that allowed me to think more carefully and critically on how I wanted to situate myself. And I really felt Islam and science was my space. I really love ilm al-kalam. I really love science. And therefore, this became really a perfect contact point for me. Now, there are some challenges that I experienced. It is these challenges that I'm going to highlight, and then I'll open the floor for Q&A. So I'm about to finish. I just have a few more pages, and that's it, inshallah. Okay? So these are challenges I'm sure some of you may have experienced. These are not exhaustive, but these are some of the main tension points that I've seen when trying to engage the academy. So the first problem here is, do we engage the tradition at all? You will find some academics who believe that the tradition has no bearing today. Particularly if you want to do like constructive or normative work, we don't need the Turath. The Turath is old. Khalas, it's outdated. We need to start from ground zero. We need to start from zero line. We need to develop new ideas. So you will find some people, they will say that Islamic studies, we need to have fresh stuff. This Ghazali, Avicenna, Razi, these are old guys. Khalas, forget them now. Let's start from new. Okay. Now others believe, no, you must start from the tradition, right? So that's the first challenge. Where do you stand here? Are you on the side that believe that tradition should be engaged? Or are you on the side that tradition should not be engaged? We should start afresh. First question. Second challenge, right? Even if you engage a tradition, which one, right? As I said earlier, there are Sunni frameworks, there are Shi'i frameworks, there are academics who come from both backgrounds, right? And if you are Sunni, okay, if you're Sunni, then which one? Are you speaking from an Ash'ari lens? Are you speaking from a Maturidi lens? Are you speaking from an Athari lens, right? Or are you speaking collectively from all, right? So that's a problem, right? That's a problem. And here, there's the tension that I found sometimes with some academics is, how open are you to pluralism? And how open are you to difference of opinions? Are you the kind of person who wants to say it's only my way or the highway? Or are you saying, okay, this is the Ash'ari perspective. I can see you're coming from an Athari angle. I can see how this is going to look like from that. Oh, okay, you're coming from the Ithna Ash'ari angle. Okay, I can see how you're looking at it from that angle, right? So tolerance for differences is another variable. Are you with me so far? Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is another tension point because you will find some people that are very exclusive. They will not tolerate anything that's outside their own perspective, right? And sometimes you'll have gatekeeping, you have politics here, right? And then there's a third challenge. So let's say you do define your madhab or your perspective, right? Then the question is, do you just copy paste or do you think modification is necessary? So when I, for example, take Ghazali, did I just take Ghazali and copy paste him like this? Or did I introduce certain tweaks, certain changes, because some of them need to be done in order for them to engage with today's context, right? And here, there are going to be disagreements. How much can you modify? Does everyone see the point here, right? How much can you modify? Do you take the Ash'ari method completely, 100% as it is, for example? Or can you take 70%? Or can you take 50%? Does everyone see the dilemma? Does everyone see just a yes or no in the chat? Is everyone clear about this? Yeah. Just these are just macro developments that I'm talking about here, right? And then finally, at least in the context that I'm sitting from, right? Here, there's also the challenge of, I use kalam a lot, right? Kalam, however, has historically developed. There's something called classical kalam. There's something called post-Avicennan kalam. There's something called post-Akbarian kalam. Which kalam? Which specific group, which specific trend are you looking at? And each of these are slightly different, right? So even when we look into a subject area, kalam in this case, there is sometimes a danger of collapsing the differences. There's also tensions about which of the formulations are correct, right? So when you kind of take all of these challenges, here's how I situated myself, and here are like how I navigated these discussions, right? So for me, I come from the starting point that the Turath must be engaged. It is not possible to have a meaningful Islamic representation within the academy unless you engage with Turath. So I personally identify as a Sunni Muslim, and because I deal mostly with philosophical subjects in science or religion, I believe that you have to engage this from a theological lens. That is why I make it very crystal clear that I look at it from an Ash'ari angle. I, however, do not believe that it's a full copy paste. I believe there are things that need to be modified, there are things that need to be changed, right? And my inspiration for all of this is this is Ghazali and Razi. These are the two big scholars within the Ash'ari framework that I believe really understood this idea, right? So that's my positionality. That's where I'm coming from. Now, given that, what are the challenges that I faced? So sometimes when I submit a paper, for example, for example, if I want to write an Ash'ari perspective on Islam and science, sometimes I have gotten feedback saying that this is polemical, saying that this is Ash'ari agenda, believe it or not. And for your benefit, I've actually copied and pasted two pictures here. Before I continue, can you see two photographs? There should be one saying science is divine science on the left, and there should be some text on the right hand side. Can you see this? Just a yes or no in the chat. You can see it, right? Okay, very, very good. So this is an article that went through Religions MDPI, and what I really like about this journal is that they actually published the review reports, right? So all I did in this article was I brought out Imam Sanusi, who is an established scholar of Ilm al-Kalam, and just put him into how his ideas can speak to Islam today, science today, right? I didn't say Ash'ari was number one. I didn't say Ash'ari was the best. I didn't even say that their other schools are wrong. I said nothing of that. I just say, starting from an Ash'ari perspective, here is a scholar. He has certain ideas that I think could be helpful. In one of the reviews, here is what it said. It pushes a blatant and gratuitous Ash'ari agenda. So, and all the other reviews were fine. I had three reviewers. Two reviewers were positive, no problem there. I know who this reviewer is. I know who did it. I'm not going to mention who it is, but the point here is you will find backlash like this. Some people do not want the tradition, for example, to gain oxygen. They believe that these are outdated models. Does that make sense? Is everyone happy with that? And I just wanted to make sure you had a concrete example. So it's not just me like giving you theory. You will find pushback. You will find pushback, right? There's also gatekeeping, right? People want to kind of hold on to certain narratives. And if you are, trying to push those narratives, then that's a problem. So there, for example, in my own space in Islam and science, there are some folks who don't believe that miracles are possible because they want to believe that the whole universe can conform to science. I push back against this from a Sunni and a Shia angle. Allah, if He wanted to, He can do miracles. So I push against this narrative, and sometimes you get critical engagement there, right? There's also a problem with individuals who they engage the tradition. Turath, no problem there. But they say, it's my school that's correct, not yours. Yani if you're speaking from any other angle, khalas, I'm not going to listen to you, right? So when you have all these pressure points, it becomes very difficult to navigate. Does everyone see the problems? Does everyone see that? Yeah. This is the kind of academic sphere that you're going to engage with should you decide to be an academic. This is not, of course, universally true everywhere. I'm talking from my experience. This is my personal experience, right? And the last challenge that I had was in the space of science or religion, what I have found is that sometimes my non-Muslim colleagues, they are very interested about Islam and science, but they don't know Islamic theology well enough. So naturally, they have to rely on existing voices to be able to arbitrate whether my work was valid or not. And because you have such a few voices in the field, some of them are very critical of the Torah. And I remember having a lot of hard time in the beginning to be able to navigate this space. I remember I had one chapter in one of my books, Islam and Evolution, on how Ash'ari theology, for example, can engage with chance. I got similar feedback. This is Ash'ari polemics. This is Ash'ari agenda. When all I was doing, because if you look at it from, the wider science religion sphere, people write from, the Protestant lens, people write from the Catholic lens. But all of a sudden, Ash'ari, agenda. All of a sudden. And I remember I felt so frustrated. I was very, very deeply disappointed. Like, why is there so much tension here? Why can you not just see the validity of a perspective, right? So how did I kind of navigate all this? What I ended up doing was I started building up a proper case by saying that, look, the Muslim world is a pluralistic world. There are many different expressions of theology. There are some seminal lines that have more establishment than others. Within the Sunni tradition, at least, the Ash'ari line is a very clear, recognizable line. And you will find this to be studied in the madrasas, and that's why it is of great relevance today. That's how I created my narrative. And in doing that, I was able to kind of substantiate that the Ash'ari line is worth exploring, right? Even if you disagree, it's worth exploring, right? And so one of the things that I learned was you cannot go into the academy with a polemical attitude. You cannot say, I'm right, everyone is wrong. That attitude doesn't work. You have to learn how to carefully word yourself such that you can show that at least there's a visible research program here, right? That you can kind of explore through, right? Just like how you're exploring through the lens of Avicenna, you're exploring through the lens of Ibn Rushd, you're exploring the Ibn Taymiyyah. No problem. We can all explore, but I am not attacking you. I'm just saying this is how this is organically built up. So you have to appreciate that you are not going to dissolve disagreements. It's very hard to dissolve disagreements amongst academics, right? What you can just do is acknowledge that there have been flan scholars, but one area that has not been studied is this angle. And so I felt that it was very important to establish from ground zero why this is an important area of study. I also was able to kind of really tone down, this idea that the Ash'ari madhab is the only correct madhab. I have now a much more open mindset through that negotiation process. And my own opinion, as I formulate, is that I want now everybody to be a part of the conversation. If you don't have that pluralistic mindset, it is very difficult, I feel, to get breathing space in the academy, right? Because in order for the field, at least in my case, Islam and science to emerge, it has to be when disagreements come to the table, right? It has to be that. You cannot get, for example, Fakhruddin al-Razi if there was no Avicenna. You cannot get Ibn Taymiyyah if there was no Razi, right? Disagreements need to come forth. So, so what I'm saying is that there needs to be a tolerance for disagreement. If that is not there, there cannot be a healthy academic mindset. Now, this doesn't mean that, it was all negative and all of that. It was a very hard journey for me personally, more so because I transitioned from STEM to humanities. But the field, alhamdulillah, is now flourishing. So in my own case, for example, in the field of Islam and science, as I said, I'm a lecturer of Islam and science in Edinburgh. We are now able to establish the courses at a postgraduate level. So this year, for instance, we started the first course on Islam and science, alhamdulillah, right? So we had Muslim students who did that. Non-Muslim students were studying Islam and science. I'm now able to kind of even supervise PhD students. I have 8 PhD students at the moment. So all doing different parts, right? We're also developing conferences such that it's completely online. So we have a conference called Islamic Colloquy of Edinburgh. And there's no like payment here. It's completely online. So we have scholars from Iran, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, bright scholars from all over the world, right? So there's good, healthy infrastructure. More importantly, there have been very important developments for the field to flourish. So I mentioned something called book series. A book series comes into formulation when a discipline has become recognized in the academy, right? So you will have a book series on organic chemistry, a book series on economics, a book series on politics. Alhamdulillah, we now have 2 book series on Islam and science. And I'm also working on the first encyclopedia of Islam and science. So by the tawfiq of Allah, there's been a lot of healthy progress.